Hey, welcome back, guys. Last episode, we went over some of the more conceptual stuff in programming, and today we're going to talk about coding specifically, so let's get started. Alright, so let's actually start learning something. Since Python is an object-oriented language, we can create groups of data called variables, and to use these variables, we have to first declare them, and give them some values. For now, the only variables I'll be using are numbers and strings. We're going to go in-depth on what the other data types are in later episodes, but for now, let's focus on those two, starting with numbers. To declare a variable, we need the variable we are creating on the left with an equal sign, on the left of an equal sign, and the value we are assigning that variable to on the right of the equal sign. When we give a variable a value, we are also giving that variable a type. This type tells us what kind of variable that it is. The value for this variable is an integer, which means that its value is a whole number. As long as the variable doesn't have a decimal point, it can be as big or small as you want it to be. Another type of variable is a float or floating point number. These are just numbers with decimal points. So instead of being 1, x would be 1.0. If we wanted to convert an integer into a decimal floating point number for some reason, like finding the area of a circle or calculating salaries, we can convert it into a different type using a casting function. A casting function converts a variable into a specific type. For example, let's say that I wanted to make x, which is equal to 1.5, an integer. What I would do is I would use the int function to turn 1.5 into 1. And if you're ever unsure about the type of variable at any point, you can use the function type to see what kind of variable it is. Variables can be many other data types than just numbers. So we can also assign words, otherwise known as strings, to them too. In order to do this, we need to surround strings with quotation marks. Let's give x the value of hello world. It doesn't matter if you use a single or double quotes to make strings, as long as both surrounding strings are the same and that you're consistent with them. If not, you will end up with an error. Now let's print x. We can use the print function to print x, which will print its value hello world. In Python, operators like plus and minus symbol have some of the same purposes in Python that they do in regular math. However, some extra uses that we'll cover in a later video. For now, let's just focus on their uses in math operators and on math operations. The basic math operators in Python are mostly the same as in math. The plus symbol adds, the minus symbol subtracts, and the asterisk and backslash multiply and divide respectively. And 2 asterisks is representative of an exponent sign, since you can't have superscripts when writing code. Then we have modulus, or the modulo symbol, or modulo operator. The modulus operator returns the remainder of a division operation. So if you were to print 3 modulo 2, 1 would be printed because that would be the remaining value. Modulus can also work with the decimal or floating point numbers. Python follows the same precedence rules for math operators that math does. This just means that it follows the order of operations, parentheses first, then exponents, etc. Now that we know how to do a few basic things with Python, let's actually start to make something a bit more interesting. First, let's start with how to get information from the user, which in our case is ourselves. The input function will take the input of the types and use it in code that we write. This data is by default a string, so if we want to build a calculator, for example, we would need to convert it into a numeric data type before doing anything else with it, or else we'll get an error. And since we're on the topic of user input and errors, let's talk about error handling for a little bit. User input isn't always the best data, and by that I mean that the data that we get from the user might cause an error, and this might be because they gave us a string where a number was required, or used too many characters or too few characters, or a myriad of other reasons. Because of this, we need to make sure that we don't get a traceback in our code, or an error. To do this, let's introduce the try and except keywords. These allow us to try a block of code that may cause an error. If the code does not cause an error, then the rest of the code and the script is executed. If the code in the try block does execute an error, however, instead of getting a traceback, then the code underneath the except keyword is executed. This way, we could give the variable a default value to allow the user to re-enter a value, or anything else we want to do. Let's look at an example of this. Pause the video for a second and see if you can tell whether or not an error will be raised and the except block will be run. It would be, because the input for x is never converted into a number, which means that on the line here. On this line is a string being added to an integer, which in this case will raise an error. And that wraps up this lesson. To go over what we covered, we learned what variables are and how to assign values to them. We learned the basic math operators of Python and how they are used, and how to get data from the user using the input function, as well as how to handle errors and tracebacks. I hope you guys learned something from this episode, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Goodbye.